My name is Owen Calloway. I am 35 years old and I work as a structural engineer at a mid-sized civil engineering firm in Columbus, Ohio. We handle infrastructure projects mostly, bridge assessments, municipal drainage redesigns, the occasional commercial foundation work that comes in when the economy is moving in the right direction. It is methodical, detail-oriented work that rewards patience and punishes assumptions, which suits me well because I am a methodical, detail-oriented person who has spent most of his adult life being patient about nearly everything, except the things that actually mattered, and being quietly wrong about which category those things fell into. I have been at the firm for 7 years. I know where the good coffee is, the pour-over place on High Street called Stoff's, not the machine in the second-floor break room, which produces something that tastes like institutional ambition and disappointment. And I know which conference rooms have the broken projector cables that nobody has reported for 8 months. And I know that the traffic on I-670 eastbound adds exactly 11 minutes to the drive home on Friday afternoons between October and March. I'm the kind of person who knows these things. The kind of person who arrives early, leaves when the work is done, eats lunch at his desk more often than not, and has been told by at least 3 separate people over the years that he is excellent at his job and difficult to know. I did not think of this as a problem for a long time. I thought of it as a reasonable trade-off. The firm needed engineers who were excellent at their jobs, not engineers who were easy to know. I had made my peace with being useful rather than warm. My previous relationship had ended 18 months before this story begins. Her name was Andrea. She was a project manager at a construction firm across town, and we had been together for 2 years, and the relationship had ended not with a fight or a betrayal, but with a conversation so quiet and so honest that it was almost harder to bear than a fight would have been. She had sat across from me at the kitchen table on a Sunday morning and said, carefully and without cruelty, that she felt like she had been trying to get close to me for 2 years and had covered a great deal of distance without arriving anywhere. That I was kind and dependable and present in all the ways that could be measured, but somehow absent in the way that couldn't. I had not known what to say to that. I had said I was sorry, and she had said she knew, and we had sat there for a while in the kind of silence that has already made its decision. After Andrea, I told myself that some people were simply better suited to solitude. I used the word solitude rather than loneliness because solitude sounded like a choice and loneliness sounded like a condition, and I preferred to believe I was choosing rather than simply failing to do otherwise. The new hire arrived on a Tuesday morning in February. Her name was on the internal announcement the Friday before, Miriam Osai, joining the structural assessment team, transferring from a firm in Cincinnati. I noted it the way I noted most internal announcements, which is to say I read it once and returned to the drainage report I had been working on and did not think about it again. She was already in the conference room when I arrived for the 9 o'clock team meeting, sitting 2 seats from the end of the table, her laptop open, a notepad beside it with 3 lines of notes already written, which told me she had done her homework on whatever was on the agenda. She was wearing a dark green blazer and the kind of composed, alert expression that people wear on their first day at a new job when they are trying to read the room before the room reads them. She had a small silver stud in each ear and her hair was pulled back, and she was very still in the way that attentive people are still, not tense, but present. The meeting was a project status update. 12 people around the table, the usual cross-talk, the usual running over on the drainage report discussion, because Henderson always had 3 more questions than the agenda allowed for. Miriam Osa sat and listened and wrote in her notepad and did not attempt to insert herself into a room she had not yet earned a position in, which I respected as a form of professional intelligence. I was introduced by name by our section lead, along with the 2 other structural engineers at the table. Miriam nodded at each of us in turn. When she nodded at me, her eyes stayed on mine for 1 beat longer than the social default, which I registered without knowing what to make of it. After the meeting dispersed into the hallway corridor, I was heading toward the elevator when I heard my name. I turned around. Miriam Osa was 4 steps behind me, moving at the pace of someone who had made a quick decision. "Owen," she said. She kept her voice low, though the nearest person in the corridor was at the far end. "I need to ask you something, and I am aware it is a strange thing to ask." I waited. "There is a team lunch today that my manager mentioned this morning." The whole structural group, apparently. I was told it was informal. She held my gaze directly, and there was nothing uncertain about her expression, only a kind of clear-eyed practicality. "I don't know anyone in that room yet. I've been at a firm in Cincinnati for 6 years, and I know how these things go, and I know that walking into a group lunch where everyone has 6 years of shared context, and you have 4 days of being the new person is a specific kind of difficult. A brief pause. If anyone asks, could you say you know me? Not lie exactly, just act as though we've spoken before. I just needed one person in my corner for an hour. I looked at her for a moment. She did not look embarrassed by the request. She looked like a person who had identified a structural problem and was proposing the most efficient available solution. We've spoken before, I said. Right now, in fact. The corner of her mouth moved. Yes, technically. Then I'm not lying, I said. Something in her posture shifted slightly, not relief exactly, but the small adjustment of a person who had braced for a more complicated response and was recalibrating. Thank you, she said. Noon, I assume, I said. I'll be there. I went back to my desk and spent the next 3 hours on the drainage report and did not analyze what had just happened. That was not entirely accurate. I spent approximately 2 hours and 40 minutes on the drainage report, and about 20 minutes thinking about a woman who had assessed an unfamiliar social situation with the same directness she had applied to her notepad at 9 o'clock, identified the critical variable, one person who would not let her stand alone in a room, and solved for it. There was something I recognized in that. Not the specific situation, but the underlying architecture of it. The preference for a clear-eyed, practical solution over the performance of not needing one. The willingness to ask for exactly what you needed rather than hoping someone would intuit it. I was at the restaurant at noon. The lunch was at a place called Tip Top Kitchen on Gay Street, the kind of casual neighborhood spot that does its lunch service efficiently enough that 12 engineers can eat and return to a job site within 60 minutes. I arrived to find Miriam already at the table, which I was beginning to understand was simply how she operated. She was between two people she had not yet met and was engaged in the competent, measured small talk of someone who had done this before in other rooms. When I sat down across from her, she looked up and said, Owen, good. 2 words, the practiced ease of someone who had been expecting me, and then returned to the conversation she had been in, which I understood was the agreed performance but which felt already like something slightly more than that. Over lunch, I watched her work the table with a skill that was not false but was clearly deliberate. She asked questions more than she answered them, which is the correct approach in a room full of people who already know each other, because it gives every person the one thing they reliably want, which is to be found interesting by a new audience. She learned names and used them. She identified the 2 quiet people at the far end of the table and redirected questions in their direction when the conversation threatened to consolidate around the louder center. At one point, our section lead, a man named David Park, who had been at the firm for 15 years and had a gift for the kind of blunt assessment that was somehow never unkind, leaned toward me slightly and said under the general table noise, She's going to be useful. I said, She already is. After lunch, walking back to the building, Miriam fell into step beside me on the sidewalk. The February cold had settled back in after a deceptive morning warmth, and she had buttoned her jacket to the top. Thank you, she said, for the hour. I didn't do much, I said. You had it handled. I had it handled because I knew someone would sit across from me who was in the arrangement. She looked straight ahead at the building entrance. It sounds small, one person, but it changes the entire geometry of a room when you know there's one person who is simply on your side. I thought about that as we went back inside. The geometry of a room. I had been in plenty of rooms where I was competent and respected and completely alone in the way that mattered, and I understood exactly what she meant. The weeks that followed revealed Miriam Osai in increments, the way a complicated piece of work reveals itself, not all at once, but in the accumulated evidence of how she approached small things. She was precise in her work, to a degree that I recognized as the expression of a standard she held for herself, rather than a performance for external approval. She caught an error in a load calculation on a bridge deck assessment during her second week that 2 senior engineers had missed, and she flagged it in a direct email to the project lead without theater and without excessive hedging, which was the correct approach, and also the approach that required the most confidence to take in a room where you were still new. She ate lunch at her desk on most days, which I noted because I ate lunch at my desk on most days, and there was something companionable about this that neither of us acknowledged. On Wednesdays, the break room got a delivery from a local bakery, North Market bread, sourdough, and an olive loaf, and usually 1 pan of something sweet. And I began bringing 2 coffees from Stoff's on Wednesday mornings, one for myself and one left on her desk before she arrived, because Wednesdays were delivery days and delivery days were better with good coffee. And that was a simple, useful thing I could do without making it into a conversation. The first Wednesday she came to my desk to say thank you, I told her the break room machine was not worth the alternative. The second Wednesday she said nothing about it at all, only nodded briefly when she sat down, which felt like the correct response. The third Wednesday she left a small container of home-cooked jollof rice on my desk without explanation or ceremony, and when I looked across the office, she was already reading something on her screen with the focused expression of someone who has completed a transaction and moved on. It was the best jollof rice I had ever eaten. I told her so at the end of the day. She said it was her grandmother's recipe, the version that used long-grain parboiled rice and smoked paprika in the tomato base, the kind of detail that told you the recipe was specific and beloved and not something casually shared. Then she went back to what she was reading. I thought about her on the drive home that evening, not with the self-conscious analysis I usually applied to noticing people, but with something quieter. The way you think about a piece of wood you've been looking at for a while and have begun to understand, not all of it, but enough to know that what you're looking at is worth understanding. The wound revealed itself on a Thursday evening in March, 6 weeks after the restaurant on Gay Street. The firm had a quarterly review dinner at the end of the month, and the structural team had been working long hours on a municipal bridge assessment with a hard deadline. That week the pressure had concentrated, and on Thursday evening at 7:30, when most of the office had emptied, Miriam and I were still at adjacent desks working through the final calculations review. The building was quiet in the particular way that large offices are quiet late at night, not peaceful but evacuated, the architecture of a working day with the people removed from it. She had been still for a long time when I looked up, not working, just looking at the screen without seeing it. Miriam, I said. She looked over, a brief pause as though she was deciding how much to give. I'm fine, she said, just tired. Okay, I said. I went back to my work for approximately 3 minutes then. Do you want coffee or do you want to tell me what's actually happening? She looked at me for a moment. Something in her face shifted, not breaking, but releasing slightly the way pressure releases when you open a valve rather than a seam. Both, she said. I went and made the coffee. When I came back, she was leaning back in her chair with her arms folded loosely, looking at the ceiling. She told me about the 6 years in Cincinnati, about a firm that had been, on paper, a significant step in the right trajectory, good projects, senior staff, the kind of institutional reputation that looks correct on a resume. In practice, it had been a team with an internal culture she had spent 6 years navigating without ever fully cracking. Not hostile, she said. Worse than hostile, in some ways, indifferent. The specific indifference of a room that has already decided who is going to be heard and communicates that decision through silence and slight repositioning rather than direct exclusion, in ways that are impossible to name specifically and therefore impossible to address. She had been good at her work throughout. The work was never the problem. The problem was the geometry of the room, the word she had used in February, and the way it never quite included her regardless of the quality of what she contributed. She had made partner track by the 4th year. She had not made partner. The explanation she had been given was calibrated carefully enough to be irrefutable and clear enough to be understood for what it was. She had left with her record intact and her confidence partially dismantled in the specific, quiet way that sustained indifference dismantles a person. Not through a single blow, but through the accumulated weight of years of being technically present and genuinely invisible. She told me all of this in a flat, even voice that was not emotionally disconnected, but was the voice of someone who had processed the facts thoroughly enough to report them without being undone by them. And so, she said when she had finished, when I walked into this building in February and saw 12 people in a conference room who all had 6 years of context I didn't have, I did not want to spend another 6 years being technically present and genuinely invisible. She paused. I identified the person in the room who looked most like he understood what being quietly alone in a room felt like and asked him to be in my corner. I sat with that for a moment. Made you think that was me? I said. She looked at me steadily. You were the only person at that table who was listening to the meeting more than performing for it, she said, and you had coffee from somewhere that was not the break room machine, which told me you had been here long enough to know the difference and cared enough about small things to act on it. I looked at the coffee cup in front of me. That is a very specific read from one team meeting, I said. I am good at reading rooms, she said. It was a survival skill. A long pause settled between us. Outside, the last of the office building lights across the street were going dark, floor by floor. I know what it is to be present and absent at the same time, I said carefully. Not in the same way, but I had a relationship end because someone I cared about told me she had spent 2 years trying to get close to me and hadn't arrived anywhere. I set down my coffee. I am very good at being in a room. I'm not always good at actually being in the room. She looked at me, not with surprise, but with the focused attention she gave to things she wanted to understand correctly. Andrea said that? She said. I looked up. I didn't mention her name. You didn't, she agreed. It sounded like a specific sentence, the kind someone says when they've thought it through carefully. She had, I said. She was right. We sat in the quiet office for a moment. We are both very good at the professional version of ourselves, Miriam said. Yes, I said, and not especially practiced at the other version. Correct, I said. She uncrossed her arms, picked up the coffee. That is a very specific thing to have in common, she said. It is, I agreed. Neither of us said anything else about it that night. We finished the calculations review and left the building at 9:15 and went to our respective cars and drove home. But something had been named in that evacuated office that had not been named before, and naming a thing changes the room it's in. March became April the way Ohio springs do, reluctantly, with rain, with the occasional cold morning that argues against the evidence of the longer light. Miriam had been at the firm for 2 months. She had found her position in the structural team the way a correctly cut joint finds its fit, not forced, not loose, but seated properly and increasingly difficult to imagine removed. She and I had fallen into a rhythm that was not romantic in any announced way, but was particular in ways that both of us understood without discussing. The Wednesday coffees, the occasional lunch that migrated from our respective desks to the small table in the building courtyard when the weather allowed. Long conversations on afternoon site visits about the projects in front of us, and about other things, moving between the professional and the personal in the natural way of people who have agreed, without agreeing, that both territories are accessible. She talked about her family in Accra, her mother who had been an architect and her father who had been a civil servant, and who between them had installed in her a very specific combination of precision and patience, that she said sometimes felt like a language she spoke that other people only partially understood. She talked about what it had meant to leave Cincinnati, not just professionally but personally, the act of starting over at 32 in a city where she knew no one, which she described not as defeat, but as a deliberate choice to refuse the version of herself that 6 years of being made invisible had been quietly trying to build. I told her about the years after my father died, when I was 28 and newly at the firm, and had channeled everything into the work because the work did not require the parts of me that were not yet functional. I told her I had confused that period of useful productivity with emotional competence, and had not noticed the confusion until Andrea named it on a Sunday morning in the kitchen. I told her that I had spent 18 months since calling the resulting solitude a preference and knowing under that it wasn't. She listened to all of it, not with the practiced sympathy of someone performing engagement, but with the focused, still attention she brought to everything she thought was worth understanding. You are not actually bad at being in the room, she said after I had finished. You are bad at believing the room wants you in it. I looked at her. That is not the same problem as what Andrea described, she said. Or it is the same problem from a different direction. She experienced your absence. You were manufacturing it as a form of protection. You pulled back before the room could decide it didn't want you. I sat with that for a long time. You're good at this, I said. Reading people, she said. Yes, it was a survival skill, as I mentioned. She paused. It is also, as it turns out, useful for other things. She looked at me steadily across the courtyard table, the April light coming down at an angle through the building overhang, and there was nothing careful or managed in her expression. Just clarity. The direct gaze she had given me in a conference room hallway in February when she had asked for one person in her corner and had not looked away when she asked. Owen, she said. Yes, I said. I'm telling you this because I want you to know I see it. The real version. The one that is not just excellent at his job and difficult to know. A brief pause. I want you to know that I am in the room and I am not going anywhere. It was the sentence I had not known I needed to hear for a very long time, and hearing it in that particular voice from that particular person in a courtyard in April with the coffee going cold between us was a disorienting and clarifying experience simultaneously. I'm in your corner, I said. I have been since February. She nodded once, slowly, like something settling into its correct position. The quarterly review dinner was on the last Friday of April. The whole firm, 40-something people, a restaurant downtown called Milestone on Broad Street, the kind of evening that functions as both celebration and calibration, you understand by the end of it where everyone actually stands. I picked Miriam up at her apartment on the north side. She opened the door in a deep burgundy dress and her silver earrings and the same composed, direct expression she brought to everything, except that there was something underneath the composure that was quieter and less armored than the version I had met in February. In the car, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I want to tell you something before we get there." I kept my eyes on the road. The last time I walked into a room full of colleagues at a firm event, I had been there 4 years and I still did not know whether anyone would choose to stand with me at the edge of a conversation. She paused. "I know that tonight I will walk in with you and that changes everything about how I will be in that room. And I want you to know that I know that it is not incidental to me." I looked over briefly. "It's not incidental to me either," I said. She looked forward for a moment. "I am careful," she said, "about people. After Cincinnati, I became very careful about who I allowed to matter to me professionally and personally. I made the exception for you quickly and deliberately, and I want you to know it was deliberate." "The lunch in February," I said. "Before that," she said. "In the meeting, you were the most genuinely present person at the table, and it was very obvious if you were looking for it." "Were you looking for it?" "I was looking for exactly that," she said. "Yes." We arrived at the restaurant. I parked and we sat for a moment in the quiet car. "The geometry of the room," I said. "What you said in February." "Yes." "You said one person changes it." "Yes, you were right," I said, "but it works in both directions. The room I have been in for 18 months, the one where I had successfully convinced myself I preferred solitude, that geometry just changed." She looked at me for a long time. Outside, through the windshield, people were arriving at the restaurant entrance in small groups, coats against the April evening. "We should go in," she said. "We should," I said. "Owen." "Yes." "I'm glad you were in the hallway," she said. "I'm glad you asked," I said. We went inside. She walked beside me, not behind me, and when David Park saw us arrive together and raised one eyebrow briefly in my direction, I did not acknowledge it and I did not look away from the room. For the first time in a very long time, I was not in a room because I was useful to it. I was in the room because there was someone beside me who had decided, deliberately and without apology, that I was worth standing next to. 3 months later, Miriam's assessment methodology for the Bridge Deck project was submitted to the Ohio Department of Transportation as part of the firm's formal proposal for a statewide inspection framework contract. It was her work substantially, the framework she had been quietly developing since her second week, the one that she had mentioned to me once in passing during a site visit, and which I had suggested she formalize in writing and bring to David Park, which she had done with the directness she brought to everything. The proposal was accepted in June. The firm was awarded the contract. David Park held a team meeting to announce it, and said, among other things, that the methodology at the center of the proposal represented exactly the kind of institutional thinking the firm needed more of. And he said Miriam's name clearly and without qualification, and I watched her receive it with the contained composure of someone who had waited a long time to have her work land in a room the way it deserved to. After the meeting, she found me in the hallway. She did not say anything for a moment. She simply looked at me with the clear, direct gaze that I had known since February and that I had come to understand as the most honest expression of who she was, precise, warm underneath the precision, and entirely without pretense. "You told me to put it in writing," she said. "You did the work," I said. "You were in my corner," she said. "I still am," I said. She nodded, one small, certain nod, the kind that does not need to be larger to carry its full weight. The story does not end with anything that would photograph well. It ends on a Saturday evening in July when Miriam was sitting on the floor of my living room, surrounded by site plan drawings for a residential consultation she had taken on. Her blazer on the chair behind her, shoes off, her reading glasses on, completely absorbed in a drainage problem at the edge of a property line. I was on the couch working through a load analysis on my laptop, which is a deeply unglamorous way to spend a Saturday evening, and also, I had learned, exactly the kind of unglamorous Saturday evening that constitutes a life being built rather than a life being managed. She looked up at one point and caught me not working. "What?" she said. "Nothing," I said. "Just thinking." "About what?" "The hallway in February," I said. "The thing you asked me." She took her glasses off, looked at me steadily. "I needed one person in my corner," she said, "for an hour." "How's the geometry of the room now?" I said. She looked around the living room, the site plans, the 2 coffee cups on the table, my jacket over the back of the other chair because I had come in and not put it away, which she had mentioned twice and which I was still working on. "Considerably improved," she said. She put her glasses back on and returned to the drainage problem. I went back to the load analysis. Outside, Columbus in July was doing what it does, warm, busy, thoroughly itself. Inside, the room was full of 2 people who had each spent too long making themselves smaller in spaces that were not large enough for what they actually were, and had finally, in a building on High Street on an ordinary Tuesday morning, found a room that fit. The right person does not always arrive in a grand gesture or a clear moment. Sometimes they arrive in a hallway with a request that sounds simple and is not. Sometimes they stand in front of you and say, not with performance, not with apology, not with the careful economy of someone who has learned to want as little as possible, that they need one person in their corner. And if you are the kind of person who has been standing alone in rooms for too long, that sentence is not a burden. It is a door. And the only question that matters is whether you are ready to walk through it. I did. And on the other side, the geometry of everything changed. Here is the expanded final paragraph. The right person does not always arrive in a grand gesture or a clear moment. Sometimes they arrive in a hallway with a request that sounds simple and is not. Sometimes they stand in front of you and say, not with performance, not with apology, not with the careful economy of someone who has learned to want as little as possible, that they need one person in their corner. And if you are the kind of person who has been standing alone in rooms for too long, that sentence is not a burden. It is a door, and the only question that matters is whether you are ready to walk through it. I did. And on the other side, the geometry of everything changed, not all at once, not dramatically. It changed the way good structures change under the right load, by settling, by finding their bearing points, by distributing weight in ways that feel eventually not like effort but like equilibrium. Miriam did not fix the part of me that pulled back before rooms could decide they didn't want me. She did something harder and more permanent than fixing it. She stayed in the room long enough that I stopped expecting her to leave. And when you stop expecting someone to leave, you stop performing the version of yourself designed to survive the leaving. You just become, slowly and without announcement, the real version. The one that was always underneath the careful, competent, difficult-to-know exterior that I had spent years polishing into something I called discipline and was really just distance with better posture. She had needed one person in her corner. What I had needed, without having the language for it, was someone who would stand in the corner with me and refuse to make that a problem. Someone who would receive the full weight of who I was, the methodical, detail-oriented, emotionally fluent in exactly two languages version, and not require it to be lighter, not ask it to be easier, not sit across a kitchen table on a Sunday morning and say, gently and truthfully, that she had been traveling toward me for years without arriving anywhere. Miriam arrived, on a Tuesday, in a hallway, with a practical request and a direct gaze and the particular courage of a person who had been made invisible for 6 years and had decided with full clarity that she was done allowing that to happen. She had walked into a new building in a new city and looked around a conference room table and identified the variable she needed and asked for it without apology. That was not vulnerability disguised as pragmatism. That was both things simultaneously, which is the only honest way to need something from another person. And I, a man who had spent 18 months calling solitude a preference and knowing it wasn't, a man who had been excellent at his job and genuinely absent from his own life, a man who had organized an entire interior architecture around the project of not wanting too much, I had said yes. Not because I knew what it would become. I didn't. I said yes because it was the right thing to do in the moment, and sometimes that is the only reason you need. And sometimes that single right thing in a single ordinary moment is the first stone of something that takes years to understand the full shape of. The site plans are still on my living room floor sometimes on Saturday evenings. The Wednesday coffees are still from Stoff's. She still reads drainage problems with her glasses on and her shoes off and the focused, irreducible concentration of someone who cares about getting things right. I still work too late and forget to put my jacket away and am, by most objective measures, exactly as methodical and detail-oriented as I was before she arrived. But I am in the room now, fully, without the managed distance, without the performance of not needing anything. Without the careful, practiced absence that Andrea had once described across a kitchen table with the honesty it deserved. I am in the room, and she is beside me, and neither of us is waiting for the other to decide that the arrangement is more trouble than it's worth. We built something sound. Not quickly, not with shortcuts, not by pretending the structural challenges weren't there. We built it the way anything worth building gets built, with patience, with precision, with the willingness to read what was actually in front of us rather than what we had been taught to expect. One person in your corner. It sounds like a small thing. It is not a small thing. It is, depending on where you have been and how long you have been there, everything.